Hello and greetings to all my friends in New Zealand and in the New Zealand Tuberous Sclerosis Association. I'm delighted to be able to join you all today, even if it is remotely. And thank you, Helen and team, for asking me or inviting me to join you at this meeting that you're having today. Helen asked me to talk specifically about the TANDem project, and I will do that. And I deliberately called it the TANDem project, or TANDem, the power of participatory research. And I'm going to try and make sure that I tell you why I think participatory research is the only way or the best way for us to do research in the TSC community. But before I go to that, just a little reminder of when I last saw you. On this picture, you can see 2018 was the date and the time that I last joined you all in Wellington for the 2018 National Conference. And in these not particularly clear photographs of mine, you can see some very familiar faces with Lisa and Helen and Murray, and hopefully many of you who were there also again at the meeting today, thinking about and talking about progress that has happened in tuberous sclerosis. So from that, thank you so much, and lovely to be able to join you. Now, I know that Helen said Lisa was already going to talk about many aspects of TAND, but I wanted to make sure that we just have a few keywords that you're all clear about. TSC, I don't need to tell you anything about that. You all live with it and know much more about it than most people. TAND, TAND levels is the next word, TAND clusters, and then TANDem itself, which is the name of the project. So at the end, I'm just going to check as you listen to our conversation, just make sure that you understand all the differences between all those different words. So hopefully Lisa has by now spoken to you about TAND, what it stands for. And hopefully Lisa has also talked to you about why we created the term TAND, in order to make sure that we have a shared language, in order to standardize, and in order to put the spotlight on this very important aspect of TSC that hadn't received a lot of clinical or research attention. And hopefully Lisa has spoken to you and explained to you the 6 levels of TAND: the behavior level, the psychiatric level, the intellectual level, the academic level, the neuropsychological level, and the psychosocial level. And I'm sure she will have spoken to you about the TAND checklist, which, at the request of families and clinicians working in the TSC community, we then made up in 2013-14 and published in 2015. And I've been very, very pleased to see how many people from so many different countries have adopted the TAND checklist and have incorporated it into their clinical practice as well. So that was the kind of background that hopefully you've already done by now. And let me now, many of you will know many of the people and faces on this picture, but these are all members of Tuberous Sclerosis International, TSCI. And I know that New Zealand is also a member of TSCI. And for many years, we have worked very much in partnership and in participation with the TSCI community to make sure that we do research that is meaningful and that is the sort of research that you, as people who live with TSC, actually want. And so after we had created the term TAND, we described the levels, we made up the TAND checklist at the request of this community, we took the information back to TSCI. And here I can see Lisa in the front smiling. And we said to people, so this is what we've provided you with. What is your response, and what are you worried about in TSC at the moment? And the interesting answer that came back from many people was the overwhelming uniqueness of TAND is a problem. And so when we asked what people meant, the answer was that everyone with TSC seems to have such a unique TAND profile. And yes, that's true, and important that we are all that we recognize we all have different needs and profiles, but it meant that doctors, clinicians, therapists, interventionists really felt paralyzed and didn't know what to do with the information. And families often felt very overwhelmed by that incredible uniqueness and in profile of TAND. And that was the thought that this wonderful person, Lauren Leclésio, then took away as part of her PhD project. So what Lauren did was she then said, and with me in Cape Town, said, well, might it be possible for us to take the TAND data, such as the data we collect on the TAND checklist that you're all familiar with, and maybe even if we can't with our eyes see patterns or groupings of these phenomena, maybe we can use data-driven strategies, in other words, artificial intelligence, computer-driven strategies to find natural groupings of TAND. And if we could do that, if we can reduce this uniqueness to smaller number of manageable groups of things, perhaps that can help us identify it more easily, treat it more easily, do research on it in a better way. And that's exactly what Lauren then went on to do. Firstly, in a small little feasibility study in Cape Town, then in a larger study as part of the TOSCA consortium of many countries around the world, and finally in a study of just around 500 people from various countries in the world. She identified that we could find 7 natural TAND clusters. And these are natural groupings of things: scholastic difficulties, overactive, restless impulsivity, aggression, temper tantrums, eating, sleeping difficulties, mood and anxiety difficulties, neuropsychological difficulties, and then a large autism-like cluster of difficulties. And so this was the key finding that we then took back to the TSCI community and said, this is what we found. What will be helpful as a next step for you? And people said, thank you, that's great, we like it. But we have 3 specific things that we would like you to do. 1, that checklist that you made up for us, can you please do it in a way that we can fill it in as families or as people with TSC ourselves? And can you do it in a way that it can be quantified? In other words, that we can also say how severe things are at the moment so that we can monitor change and progress. Number 2, can you perhaps put that checklist in an app so we could fill it in on our smartphones? And importantly, we can identify the difficulties, but can you please give us a toolkit of tips and advice of things that we can do to improve outcomes for ourselves and for our families? And that was exactly the rationale, the background, the motivation for the TANDem project. So the full title is TANDem: Empowering Families Through Technology. But before I show you the aims and tell you a bit about what has actually happened with the TANDem project over the last 4 years, I have to share a little secret with you. And the secret is this. When I was in New Zealand in 2018, I actually spent a few weeks of my sabbatical time after the TSC conference working on the outline and the ideas for the TANDem project. And I'm going to show you a little picture. This is one of my doodles and hand drawings that I was working on while I was sitting in the dining room of friends of ours in Palmerston North on North Island. And these were the kind of initial drawings where we tried to think about who will be the partners and the project, aim 1, aim 2, aim 3, the timelines, how things will link, etc., so that we can, at the end, get to an app. This is my attempt at drawing an app that can work for people around the globe. So thank you to New Zealand, and thank you to all of you for being part of the inspiration for this project. And this is what it looks like, that strange drawing of mine once you give it to a graphic designer. Project with multiple partners where we started out with a multi-stakeholder launch meeting that then led to the project, and I'll tell you about the 3 aims, that then was followed by another multi-stakeholder review meeting to plan what we will do to make sure that this thing can be scaled up and scaled out around the world. So 3 aims. The first aim, exactly as families have asked us to do, develop and validate a quantified, self-completed version of the app, of the TAND checklist, build it into the app, and then make sure that it's valid. So we're comparing it to data from TSC Alliance database and to data from Boston Children's Hospital and Cincinnati. The second aim of the project was to generate consensus clinical recommendations for the identification and the treatment of TAND, because many people do different things, but there has not to date been any consensus recommendations for these things. And then once we have done that, to build that into the app as a toolkit and to make sure that it works and it's clear and it's acceptable to people in the TSC community. Then the third aim was to build a scalable and a sustainable global TAND consortium with lots of networking activities, capacity building activities, and public engagement or impact activities. So what I'm going to do now is just very briefly tell you about what we've done about each of those aims, where we're at, and then what our next step plans are. Firstly, it's a big team. Anna Janssen from Belgium and I are the PI, the leaders of the project. We have an action group. We meet on a weekly basis. We have a steering group that meets monthly. And we have a number of other groups that support different parts of the project. But most importantly, we have, as part of the research team, a family representative group. And in each of these groups, we have people who live with TSC or family members of people with TSC, to make sure that in each step of what we do, we have the voice and the reminders from family members to make sure that we stay on track. So, brief update on where we are. Aim 1 was about the development of the TAND self-report quantified checklist. So we're calling it the TAND SQ, and to make sure that it's valid. So what we have done is, after a year or 2 of lots and lots of work by the TAND consortium, we now have a TAND SQ. This is what the front page looks like. It's currently under review. And as soon as it's been accepted and published, we want to make it available to all of you. And it'll be available free, like the other one. And here's just, you can see how we've quantified, for example, questions. When something is a problem, yes, then we're going to say, how much has it been a problem over the last month? And you're going to be able to check out from 0 to 10. People also ask us to have a little bit of space where you can make a note if for your own records you want to jot down something. A very nice additional feature on this is at the end of the self-report TAND SQ, you can then also identify your or your family members' own TAND clusters, those 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 clusters that I've mentioned we had identified. And those clusters will then be relevant to the next aim that I'll tell you about. We have also, over the last few years, taken that TAND checklist and built it into an app. So both on Android and on iOS platforms, you will be able to, and we're currently piloting it and testing it out, log in, set it up, answer questions about your TSC family, your story, fill in checklists, and it will then, once you filled it in, automatically show you what your TAND cluster profile looks like. As I've said, we've done initial validation. Families and professionals have found it very helpful and useful. It takes about 10 or 15 minutes to fill in. And some people maybe take a little bit longer, but that's all very encouraging information for us. That was aim 1, now aim 2. Aim 2 was to come up with consensus recommendations for how we should find TAND and how we should treat TAND. And we planned that we would first do a scoping review, and I'll say a word about that, then look at the detailed literature in each cluster, and then bring all that information together in a consensus conference, which we held in 2020. Here you can see us all during the COVID pandemic, doing all our work online. And so first, we got the scoping review done, and that was a paper on all TAND research that had ever been performed. Now, that was a very useful exercise for us to get a sense of what's been done in the landscape of TAND, where are the gaps, and therefore, where should we prioritize future research? It was very encouraging. It was very nice to see that over the years, more and more TAND research started to be done, as you can see in this graph. I started doing TSC research here in 1997. You can see very little had been done on TAND up to that point. Many parts of the world have had some publications on TAND, but one of the other observations we made was actually the majority still comes from North America and Western Europe. And so we still have a task to make sure that we have more representative research across the globe. And we also, in this paper, identified a number of key gaps of information that we really need to try to fill as a global community in the coming years. We then took that information from the literature research. We made a group of cluster teams, as we call them, for those clusters that I mentioned to you earlier. We asked each of them to write cluster chapters and make summaries. We discussed it. We did some voting. We had our consensus conference. It was a very detailed and long process. And in the end, we came up, and that led to us coming up with some recommendations. And this is visually what the consensus recommendation manuscript and documents that we will create will look like. We realized that there were some core principles, relates to all the TAND clusters, and it's kind of general principles that we should all use when we identify and treat TAND. Then we have drafted specific recommendations for each of the different clusters: autism-like, dysregulated behaviors, eating, sleeping, mood, anxiety, neuropsychological, overactive, impulsive, and scholastic. And very importantly, and it was a message that came out so clearly through our work over the last few years, was the importance of having what we call a wraparound psychosocial cluster. The recognition and realization that we need to, that how we are psychologically and socially in the world, how our caregivers are able and have capacity to care for their family members with TSC is something that really needs to wrap around everything. So we also generated a set of recommendations specifically about the psychosocial needs of families with TSC. I don't have a lot of time, but I'm just going to show you the 10 key core principles, just so that you can get a sense of what you might see once those papers have been reviewed. Everyone with TSC is at risk of TAND, and therefore everyone with TSC needs lifelong monitoring for the possible emergence of TAND. We should screen at least once a year and follow up with action when something is identified. The overall goal is to do early identification and early intervention for whatever the difficulty may be that we identify. A reminder that TAND clusters cluster together. So when you or your child or your family member has something in a particular cluster, we need to also look for difficulties in the other clusters. Always remember the impact of physical health problems and medications on TAND. Number 7, families are the experts in TSC and TAND. So all clinicians should work with families to make sure we come up with the best possible plans. We emphasize the need to have what we call a biopsychosocial whole system plan. So it should not just be about medications for TAND. It should be about all sorts of supports, interventions, enhancements, accommodations, and so on. We need to be evidence-based and evidence-informed. What that means is we really need to try to make sure that we don't give random interventions, but that we base it on facts and information. In TSC, this is a challenge, but this is the goal. And ultimately, our goal is not just to take away symptoms, but to make people have the best possible outcome in their lives and a quality of life in their journey with TSC and TAND. So here you could, hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the messages we will give. And here's a very simple one that I've said already. Screen, act, repeat. At least once a year, do something if you identify, and do it again. So we've generated the recommendations. We are in the process of building the toolkits into the app, and this has been a very lovely creative process. And in the next month, we should be ready to share it with consortium members and with families to get their feedback about the clarity, the appropriateness, etc., etc. With a goal that once that's been done, we will be able to open it up to a global community. So the idea is, once you're in the app, if you click on your cluster profile, it will take you to a toolkit of things that you can seek. So those might be extra diagnoses, support, etc. But also importantly, things that you can do yourself at home and in your own community. And that was an important message that came from families to us. Aim 3, we wanted to build a global consortium, and you can see on this picture we have 20-something team members from many countries, and we've encouraged all of them over the course of the project to do impact things, like have meetings, like present at conference, and we've over the years presented at many conferences about the TANDem project and about TAND. And here you can see a lovely picture of the consortium members when we all came together in November last year in South Africa to do that review meeting that I mentioned early on, representing many, many different organizations from all over the world. But one of the things, we were keen not just to do this, the typical things one might do. We also wanted to have some very targeted impact activities, really to make sure that we leave something, a footprint behind after this project. So for example, last year, we had a virtual TAND mini symposium. We had 10 presentations from 6 countries, about 60 participants who joined us online on Zoom. And there was a lovely range of preclinical, clinical, and qualitative or interventional research on TAND that was presented. We also, with the TSA UK, they allowed us to use travel money that we couldn't use during COVID to create little seed grants. So we actually awarded 3 relatively small amounts of money to groups. One that will focus on TAND in India, one that will focus on sleep difficulties, that's a big problem in TSC, and one that will focus on looking after caregivers, caring for caregivers, and the well-being program for families. And when we were in South Africa in November last year, we had a TANDem impact event with families, with clinicians, with the TAND consortium, where we had a combination of talks and presentations about TAND and TANDem, but also had some roundtable discussions with families and with the local clinicians to make sure that we could identify and listen to their needs and think how we can support them to develop some of those initiatives. So that's the project, the 3 main aims, and I hope I've given you a sense of where we're at and what we've done. And hopefully by now, all the keywords have fallen into place and you're clear about the difference between TAND and TAND levels, TAND clusters and TANDem. And maybe just the last word to wrap up about next steps and why I wanted to call this the power of participatory research. The most exciting thing for us has been that right from the beginning, this project was done with people in the TSC community, not academics doing something and then coming to families, but we've had you as part of the project, in the background of the project, in the foreground of the project. And Anne and I really think this is the only way to do truly meaningful research. And we hope that you'll agree. Our next steps, of course, we're at the end of this project by the end of 2023. We now want to use what we've learned to think what we can do in the global community to reduce that gap between what we know and actually giving people access to interventions. So this is what we're thinking about at the moment, how we can do that, what the priorities might be. The one thing I want to say is we want to make sure that we include all Tuberous Sclerosis International organizations. And so you are in our minds as participants and as partners for the next step of the TANDem project as well. Here's a picture. If you want to take a picture, it'll take you directly to the consortium website. It'll take you to the protocol paper that outlines the whole TANDem project and to that scoping review in case any of you are interested to look at that. But I want to end with an invitation to all of you as well. On the 29th of June this year, we will have another TAND mini symposium, and it's free and open to anyone from anywhere in the world, either to submit and present something, but also just to come and listen and ask questions about what's happening in TAND and TAND research around the globe. So I hope we will see some of you there. Timing might not be great, but you are still welcome to join us if you can. We will also record it and make the information available to families. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. Greetings from this lovely, friendly bunch of people in the TAND consortium. I hope you have a wonderful meeting and that we will all meet again in person very soon. Thank you very much to you all. Bye-bye.